Who doesn't love a wedding? Oh. Well, you're getting one anyway, because Spider-Man is about to marry Mary Jane Watson. From his very first appearance in 1962, Spider-Man was intended to be not just a superhero, but a superhero whose alter ego had to contend with real-life struggles. With those struggles would come the typical milestones of life, and we shared in them, as we saw Peter Parker graduate from high school, enroll in university, leave home, and then graduate from university. Eventually. One thing throughout that time that we hadn't seen him do was get engaged. There had been girlfriends, of course. Betty Brant and Gwen Stacy had come and gone, but it was the woman that he briefly dated between seeing those two who would go on to be Mrs. Peter Parker. Gerry Conway is the man who, as writer of The Amazing Spider-Man, decided to make big changes to Peter's love life. Firstly, he killed off Gwen Stacy, in the story that, it is said, marked the end of the Silver Age of comics. Then he built up Mary Jane until she was the clear number one in Peter's life. When Marv Wolfman took over writing duties, he had very different ideas. He remembered the days of the carefree, life's just about having fun and going to parties Mary Jane. He believed her character had moved too far away from that, and he's gone on record as saying he never much cared for her. So he wasted no time at all in getting Peter to propose to her in issue 182 of The Amazing Spider-Man, so she could turn him down for very MJ reasons. Too much of a free spirit, can't be tied down, that kind of thing. After that, Mary Jane hung around a bit, left the Spider-Man comics completely, returned, and the pair of them became close friends once more. Although Stan Lee stepped down as the regular writer of The Amazing Spider-Man in 1973, he launched a Spider-Man newspaper strip in 1977. With a more mature readership, he focused more on soap opera-style elements to those stories than superheroics. As such, it occurred to him that Spider-Man marrying Mary Jane would fit the strip perfectly. He suggested the idea to Marvel's then editor-in-chief Jim Shooter at a comic convention, and after he put it to the attendant audience, who went wild, in a good way, at the suggestion, Jim Shooter decided to mirror the development in mainstream Marvel continuity. David Michelinie was the regular writer for The Amazing Spider-Man at that time, and he wrote the script for the big wedding issue, although Jim Shooter came up with the plot. In fact, David Michelinie was someone who didn't want MJ and Peter to get married. Nonetheless, he guided them to their big day. First things first, the proposal. That happened at the end of issue 290, which was brought to life courtesy of John Romita Jr.'s pencils. Peter, despite feeling content with many aspects of his life, felt that he was missing something, someone. Someone who he could open up to about his life not just as Peter Parker, but also as Spider-Man. He soon worked out that only one woman fit the bill, and on the last page of the issue, he blurted out his proposal. We were promised an answer in the next issue, and it wasn't long in coming, as we see on page 1. So history repeats itself, although all is not quite as it seems, as the no quickly becomes an I don't know. It seems the proposal was a shock. Not only that, but she has to go and visit her sister in Pittsburgh urgently. By the end of the issue, Mary Jane calls him from Pittsburgh. She says that she realises that not only does she need him there to help her, but she needs him in her life full stop. Unfortunately, this coincides with the Spider Slayer causing havoc in Manhattan. As is always the case with Peter, duty wins out. But for once, it is duty to Mary Jane, and he leaves straight away for the airport. Issue 292 sees Mary Jane deal with some family problems and work out why she has always pursued a carefree lifestyle. It also gives us some great Mary Jane and Spider-Man action. It is the perfect issue to show why these two work so well as a couple. We have seen Peter team up well with other women in the past, such as the Black Cat and Joy Mercado. But this isn't just solving a mystery or defeating a villain. This is working out life's problems together. We see that in this issue, and so does Mary Jane, which prompts her, by the end of it, to say, "Yes, Peter, I'll marry you." Marvel really did make an event out of the wedding. For a start, MJ's gown wasn't designed by one of Marvel's artists. Instead, Willie Smith, a genuine fashion designer who, to a degree, had revolutionised the American fashion industry, was given the job. Sadly, he wouldn't get to see the result of his labours, as he died in April of 1987 at the age of 39. Apart from, naturally, advertising the wedding in their own comics, Marvel hit upon the idea of recreating the wedding with real-life stand-ins before a baseball game between the New York Mets and the Pittsburgh Pirates.
The tongue-in-cheek ceremony was an intimate one. 50,000 guests were on hand at Shea Stadium to watch cartoon character Spider-Man marry longtime love Mary Jane Watson.
I pronounce you Spider-Man.
Spider-Man creator Stan Lee officiated at the home plate ceremony. The cartoon...
This resulted in a slew of coverage, be it photo layouts in the New York Times and Sports Illustrated, seriously, or TV slots on Entertainment Tonight and Good Morning America. And here is one of those slots. Doesn't it look awesome? I'm not sure what's less convincing, Spider-Man's outfit or Mary Jane's wig. Finally, the big day dawned. This famous cover, one of two versions, the other featuring Peter in his Spider-Man outfit, was by legendary Spider-Man artist John Romita Sr. And as you'll see, Marvel went on to get a lot of mileage out of it. It would be reasonable to expect a big-name artist working on the story itself. But surprisingly, the job went to Paul Ryan, working with ubiquitous inker Vince Colletta. Paul was still relatively new to Marvel when he was given the assignment, although he did go on to produce a lot more work for them, including a 5-year run on the Fantastic Four in the 1990s and the criminally underappreciated DP7 for Marvel's New Universe line. So, tissues at the ready? We better get a move on. We don't want to be late. The wedding is a couple of days away, and until then it is action, action, action. Well, for the first half a dozen or so pages anyway. Primarily, that is because Electro has escaped from police custody. He was being transported in a police van, and some friends of his helped bust him out. Things then go the way they usually do. Spider-Man has a fight with Electro and his goons. He saves the lives of some passers-by. He ends up defeating Electro and Electro's goons, and then the police inexplicably decide that Spider-Man is in on it, although at least one of them seems to be sensible. From there he goes on to foil a bank heist, and from there to another bit of do-gooding and another bit of do-gooding. And this is all very intentional, because he wants to get as many photographs as he can of Spider-Man in action so he can sell them to the Bugle to help pay for the wedding. Later on, whilst he is developing some photos back at his apartment, Mary Jane stops by. She's dropping off some of her stuff as she slowly, bit by bit, moves in. And during that visit, she asks what we've all wondered from time to time, which is that when Peter sets up the camera, how comes it doesn't just take pictures of brick walls? And he says sometimes it does, if he moves too fast. And then he goes on to explain how it actually works. There's a micro transmitter in his belt buckle, and whenever it and he passes in front of the lens of his camera, a radio signal triggers the shutter. That's really clever. I wonder when they thought that one up. Paul Ryan, the penciler on this issue, has gone on record as stating that one of his biggest influences in terms of comic book art is Curt Swan. Now, Curt Swan, for those of you who don't know, was the artist on Superman for 30 odd years. And you can really see his influence in some of these illustrations, with those clean but well-defined outlines. Coincidentally, Paul Ryan actually went on to be the artist for Clark Kent and Lois Lane's wedding. How spooky is that? Later on, back at the Daily Bugle, there is a surprise party, and even J. Jonah Jameson is being nice, or at least he's trying to be, as his big piece of advice for Peter is to be sure before he actually gets married. Once you say I do, there's no turning back. Peter, who is clearly easily influenced and something of an advertiser's dream, instantly thinks he's right. Marriage is a big step. Am I really sure? Am I really ready for it? As he leaves the party, Peter bumps into Betty Leeds, who quite awkwardly says that she and Ned will both be at the wedding. And that's awkward because Ned Leeds actually died recently, in the same issue that he was revealed as being the Hobgoblin. Or was he? And then after that, we have a moment for you romance lovers out there. Because on his way home, before he saw MJ, he stopped off and bought the ring. And now he proposes to her properly. Well, melodramatically, but you catch my drift. And how brilliant is that panel? Then after dinner, they have a conversation wherein they both kind of intimate that they're both having doubts about the wedding. But that's cut short by a phone call from one of MJ's friends, who we only know as Bruce. Now, some commentators have suggested that this is supposed to be Bruce Wayne. But there's nothing in the story to suggest that, other than the fact that his name is Bruce and he's rich. There are comments about the fact that she knows him from Hollywood. And later on in the story, he's on set. So why, if they're trying to intimate it's Bruce Wayne, why would there be all talk alluding to acting? Personally, I think it's supposed to be Bruce Willis. We never see his face. We do see Bruce later, but you never see his face. Now, Bruce Willis in 1987, he'd only just started making films. I mean, really just. However, Moonlighting, the TV series in which he starred alongside Sybil Shepherd and that really catapulted him to fame, and it did catapult him to fame, they'd been on TV for 2 years. And I think if this is supposed to be anybody else, and I think it is because of the fact that they hide the face, I think it's him, Bruce Willis. It turns out Bruce was calling just to make sure she hadn't changed her mind about getting married, and apparently she hasn't. Mary Jane then says she has to shoot off to see Willie, who is a designer. She was supposed to do a fashion layout for him on Sunday, and she can't now do that because they're getting married. We then see her talking to Willie, which is a nice little touch, because it is Willie Smith, the guy who actually designed Mary Jane's wedding dress. And of course, by this point, by the time that people would see this comic, in real life, Willie had died. He says he understands why she can't do the fashion shoot. Very good of you. And we can actually see on his little drawing board there some sketches representing Mary Jane's dress. And then as she leaves, he says that he's going to send a little surprise to her in the next couple of days. After she leaves his office, a guy approaches her and hands her a tape. And he says that his employer asked him to get her to play the tape in a nearby parked up Ferrari. Naturally, she gets in the Ferrari, plays the tape, and it's a recording from Bruce. And again, if we are saying, is this Bruce Wayne or Bruce Willis? As the tape is played, he says, "Check the glove box, baby." Is that how Bruce Wayne speaks to women? Does he call them baby? I'm no expert, but I've got a funny feeling he doesn't. Bruce Willis, however, in Moonlighting, used to refer to Sybil Shepherd's character, Maddie, as Maddie Baby. I close my case. In the glove box, by the way, are 2 tickets to Paris. And Bruce says she can keep the Ferrari and pick him up on her way to the airport. And Mary Jane seems to be tempted. After Peter and Mary Jane visit Aunts Anna and May, Peter then travels home alone on the tube, and that is because Mary Jane is meeting a friend. And both we and Peter see that this friend pulls up in a Ferrari, and again it's Bruce. Peter tries to not be jealous, but he does worry and paces the ceiling all night. He rings Mary Jane to see where she is, but she doesn't answer. Bear in mind they don't live together at this point, and these are the days before mobile phones. And then eventually, at 1 o'clock in the morning, there's a knock at the door, and it's Mary Jane. Apparently, after seeing Bruce, she's spent the last couple of hours walking around Manhattan, and she does seem quite introspective. She says to Peter she needs to think, and where does he go to think? And he says, "I'll take you if you want." She said, "Yes." So he takes her to the top of the Empire State Building. She says it wasn't quite what she had in mind, but she's enjoying the view of Times Square, the Pan Am Building, Brooklyn Bridge. A mention of Brooklyn Bridge makes things a little bit awkward because, of course, that is where Gwen Stacy died. Shortly after that, Peter says, "Come on, we've been here long enough. I'll take you home." As they're swinging back, Mary Jane thinks to herself she has to admit that as much fun as it is being driven around in a limo or a Ferrari, I assume, you can't beat web swinging around town. That mention of Gwen has made Peter think even more, put even more doubts in his mind, because he's thinking that Gwen was put in harm's way because of her relationship with him. What if marrying Mary Jane does exactly the same thing to her? And what if the result is the same? Peter is still awake when the sun rises on the next day. MJ, however, is having a whale of a time because the dress from Willie Smith has arrived at her apartment. She rings Peter, telling him how excited she is, and he, rather unconvincingly, says, "Yeah." Me too. Later that day, Peter stops by at the hospital to see Flash Thompson. He's in there because he was injured by the hobgoblin. Or was he? And Peter asks him if he will be his best man. Isn't that great? It had been so easy for Flash Thompson to have just remained a thorn in Peter's side throughout his life, from high school all the way into adulthood. But he isn't. And I think the fact that they become great friends and he's now going to be his best man just adds so much more depth, rounds out that relationship so much. Next day, Peter has his bachelor party at the Coffee Bean with Harry Osborn and Flash Thompson. Yes, that's right, Flash is out of hospital already. He confides in them his doubts about getting married, but Harry says that marriage was the best thing that ever happened to him. Flash, not so much. He says that when he got married to Shashan, it was a total disaster. So Peter says, there you go, so you agree with me, marriage is a mistake. And Flash says, no, you've got it totally wrong. He thinks about being married all the time. His foul-ups have only made that kind of happiness even more desirable, more precious. And if he, Peter, has a chance at that, then he darned well better go for it. And at the end of the day, it's quite simple. Flash says, do you love her? To which Peter says, yes, desperately. So Flash says, all right then, it's settled, and calls a toast for the wedding and for true love. At the other end of the spectrum, Mary Jane is having a massive hen party, held at a swanky hotel and full of glitterati. Some of whom, it seems, rather than trying to help dispel doubts, are actually trying to place doubts in Mary Jane's mind. It doesn't seem to affect her though, but knowing MJ, as we do, we know that at times she acts as though life is one big party, when on the inside she feels very differently. That night, Peter dreams about the wedding, and he dreams that his worst enemies are present, and he ends up having to fight them all off, but then he realises that it's not him that they're after, but Mary Jane. And after the dream ended with him not being able to keep them away from Mary Jane, he wakes up again with those nagging doubts about her safety. Mary Jane, as she leaves her hen party, is picked up by Bruce, and as she says to him that she would rather not be alone right now because she has a decision to make, we see Peter sitting atop the Brooklyn Bridge, and he also has a decision to make. Finally, the day of the wedding arrives. All the guests are there, but there is no sign of either Peter or Mary Jane. Eventually, late, Mary Jane arrives, screeching to a halt in a sports car. And just as Flash is stammering that he's sure there's a reason for Peter being late, Peter arrives. Yes, they both had to give the situation some more thought, some more in-depth thought. But at the end of the day, they still wanted to get married because their love was so strong. And now, finally, they do get married. And I love the fact that there are only two people crying in this picture, Aunt Anna and Jolly Jonah. And it's nice also that they've included Willie Smith. Then we have the wedding breakfast. Food, drink, speeches. Oh, and Mary Jane has a present for the pair of them from Bruce. It's those tickets to Paris, as well as the use of his private villa. We then skip forward 2 weeks and we see Peter carrying MJ across the threshold as they return from their honeymoon. A honeymoon that she says was an adventure. Peter says that having spent 2 weeks in a luxury villa in France, what on earth are they going to do in his dump of an apartment? Mary Jane says that's easy. They'll do what they would do anywhere in the world, and that is live happily ever after. Yeah. As I said before, Jim Shooter provided the plot for this issue, with David Michelinie scripting it. Originally, however, the plot was Michelinie's too. His idea was for Spider-Man to suffer a concussion early on in the issue, and then, as a result, hallucinate people from his past, such as Uncle Ben and Gwen Stacy, who he would discuss his fears and doubts with. Actually, those fears and doubts were pretty much the same as the ones that made it into the story we got. The main one being that by marrying Mary Jane, Peter would expose her to danger. Despite the similarities, Jim Shooter wanted something different, so provided his alternative plot. That's it. The deed is done. But there was that reference on the last page to the adventure they had on their honeymoon. So let's check that out. In Peter Parker, The Spectacular Spider-Man, Annual Number 7. Originally, the plan was to use this issue to present the still to this very day unpublished story from the third issue of the Spectacular Spider-Man magazine from 1968. That series was cancelled after issue 2, with the next issue already being half complete. After nearly 20 years, the original creative team were reunited so they could complete what they had begun. Finally, the tale of the TV terror would be revealed to the world. Or not. With Peter and MJ's relatively quickly arranged wedding being the event of the year, Marvel decided that there would be more interest in their honeymoon. And so Jim Owsley was tasked with bringing us that tale, along with artist Alan Kupperberg. I know that Puma is on the front cover of this annual, but nonetheless there is something reassuring about seeing him on page 1 of the actual story, albeit that reassurance is a little misleading. At this point, his uncle is putting him through a kind of trial by combat with other members of his tribe. And once that's done, the uncle points out that Puma owes Spider-Man a great debt, and it's a matter of personal honour, because Spider-Man helped Puma defend the tribe from the Beyonder, and Puma hasn't so much as even thanked him. And his uncle wants him to find Spider-Man and express in some way a level of gratitude or thanks. Peter and Mary Jane, meanwhile, have been dropped off at their honeymoon villa in the south of France by a taxi driver who, well, look, you'd never guess he was French, would you? Wearing that beret and striped top. I wonder where he's hidden his string of onions. We then see them settling into the apartment, taking nice long walks on the beach, going to restaurants where everyone seems to know Mary Jane and kind of ignores Peter. It's while they're at the restaurant that a guy representing one of the world's top modelling agencies says to Mary Jane that he wants to sign her up to an exclusive contract. She says she'll consider it, but she doesn't really. After that, they drive home, they stop off by the sea to have a nice little romantic interlude, and so far, so very Archie, really. However, when they arrive back at the villa, excellent! Thomas Fireheart, aka Puma, is there waiting for them. Finally, some action. Let the fighting begin. Oh, it appears he's brought them some presents. Some crystal lovebirds. Oh, God. Yeah, you said it, Pete. I mean, look at that cover. Look at the aggression on Puma's face as he tears in half the Amazing Spider-Man Annual 21. Bared teeth, all that kind of thing. And crystal lovebirds. But he hasn't just brought wedding gifts. He's also brought a job offer for Peter. 2 job offers, in fact. One of them would be giving Peter the opportunity to work for Fireheart Industries in one of his labs. Because in Marvel Comics, any rich character has to own at least one lab, regardless of what their business is. The other job would be for Spider-Man, and he would go on various missions with Puma. And he could choose which missions he went on, because Thomas knows that their moral compasses aren't quite aligned. So if Peter didn't feel comfortable with a mission, he could turn it down. Now this would mean a lot of travelling around the world, and MJ thinks it's a great idea. Peter isn't so sure, although he does feel the pressure to accept the offer, because it comes with an $80,000 a year salary. Whilst he's mulling it over, he agrees to go on one mission for Thomas Fireheart to kind of feel out the lie of the land, and that will be to recover some stolen property, a very expensive golden egg. So whilst Mary Jane parties with the local jet set, Thomas Fireheart provides Peter with a replacement Spider-Man uniform, including web shooters, so that he can undertake this mission. Peter ponders the fact that he must have been under a lot of scrutiny from Thomas Fireheart's company for his people to be able to replicate his equipment so closely. However, it is quite reassuring that they couldn't quite get the formula right for the web fluid, and actually the fluid that they have created is a lot more brittle than Peter's own formula. So Spidey heads back to Thomas Fireheart's laboratory where he tries to correct the formula. And he does improve it. It now isn't brittle anymore. However, it is highly acidic, bizarrely. we see that Thomas Fireheart is monitoring Spider-Man, and it is clear that there is more going on than we, or Peter, have been led to believe. The stolen golden egg has been hidden, quite bizarrely, in St. Victor's Basilica, and Spidey quickly makes his way there, where he comes across a French priest who doesn't speak a word of English. But Spider-Man isn't the only person there looking for the egg, because there are also 3 ninjas there. And Spider-Man says, "I bet they don't speak English either." A little bit presumptive, Peter. This is the 21st, late 20th century. They could just as easily be from New York. Spidey quickly deals with the ninjas and he finds the golden egg, or the ova ignata to give it its correct name. As he does find it, we suddenly see this quite bizarre looking big chap who proclaims himself as the guardian of the ova ignata. Sorry, is that guardian employed by the church? And despite the guardian's overly dramatic, shouted posturing, I love the way that Spider-Man deals with him so nonchalantly, to the degree that he doesn't even speak to the guy. However, there's a much more down-to-earth threat that Spider-Man needs to concern himself with, because that French priest was no French priest at all. He was somebody else that's there looking for the golden egg. And as he shoots at Spider-Man, and of course misses, his gunshots prompt some kind of mechanical construct to come out of nowhere and start to try to defend the egg. And it does that by shooting the fake priest with a laser and then trying to do the same with Spider-Man. During the course of the melee that follows, Spider-Man drops the golden egg, but he saves it from being damaged by snagging it with his web line. However, he's forgotten that his webbing at the moment has that highly acidic quality, and that ruins the egg. This makes Spider-Man realise that he's basically failed what was essentially an audition for that job with Thomas Fireheart, and he takes it out on the construct, smashing it to tiny pieces. But in doing that, he discovers that one of the components is the same as a component that he saw back in the Fireheart Industries lab, and he realises that Thomas Fireheart has been behind all of this. Mary Jane is at another swanky restaurant, and while she's there, she sees that Thomas Fireheart is also there, sitting at a table, waiting. He's waiting for Peter, who he says is over an hour late, and he's really not impressed with him. And then we have a great little sequence where Thomas Fireheart is trying to slag off Peter, but Mary Jane is just ignoring what he's saying and complimenting him on things like his tie and his cologne. Then Peter arrives, and just as Thomas is about to berate him for being late, Peter dumps the smashed up construct on the floor and empties a bag full of shredded Spider-Man uniform in front of him. He says that Thomas set him up and the whole job offer was nothing more than a big joke. Thomas then does say that Peter is an idiot and that the job offer was legitimate, but Peter says that he just doesn't trust him. As much as some of the more stuffy patrons of the restaurant are appalled by this scene, Mary Jane's friends finally see what she sees in Peter, and they think it's brilliant. As does Mary Jane, who is loving every moment of it. The whole scene ends with Peter dumping the golden egg on the dinner table and telling Thomas that he has his self-respect, unlike him. We then move forward a few days to the end of the honeymoon, and Peter and MJ are taking one last walk along the beach when Thomas Fireheart pulls up. He says he is truly ashamed of how he's behaved. The debt of honour still remains, therefore the job offer still stands. But Peter has an alternative suggestion. He says that as long as Thomas Fireheart destroys all of the data he's been holding on him, he will consider the debt to be repaid. Fireheart agrees, and he then wishes them every happiness in the future. And that's the honeymoon. It's not quite the massive adventure that Mary Jane promised us at the end of the Amazing Spider-Man annual, but I suppose it had to be a bit different. Having, for example, Dr. Octopus kidnap the bride would have been a little bit too cheesy. So there you have it. The wedding's over, the honeymoon's over, and Peter and Mary Jane can now truly begin their new lives together. And what lives they were. The two of them were a great couple, and the married dynamic gave us new adventures that we otherwise just wouldn't have had. In fact, it's hard to imagine what Peter's life would have been like had he not married Mary Jane. Well, hard for us, not so hard for Marvel. 3 years after the wedding, the title that brought us Peter's marriage to Gwen Stacy brought us What If the Amazing Spider-Man Had Not Married Mary Jane? Behind the nice play on the classic cover, we have a tale from Danny Fingeroth. He had a stint as editor of the Spider-Man titles in the 80s and went on to write The Deadly Foes of Spider-Man, one of my favourite Spider-Man limited series. The artist is Jim Valentino, probably best known as yet another one of those creators who went on to co-found Image Comics. After a recap of the events that led up to Peter and Mary Jane's wedding, we of course see an alternate reality in which Alistair Smythe's Spider Slayer nearly kills Mary Jane. Nearly kills, but not quite. However, that is enough to make Peter realise just how much danger he is placing her in. And that is enough to make him decide to jilt her at the altar. Mary Jane, despite of course being upset, says that she understands. But that is the end of their relationship. Ironically, it's Peter who takes it much harder. He becomes angry and resentful that his duty stops him from having a full and happy life. He becomes reckless in how he goes about his heroics. And even after he joins the Wild Pack, Silver Sable says to him that he's becoming careless due to his inner anger. Aunt May is worried that he's going to harden his heart to stop himself from loving anybody else and being loved, to protect himself and them from being hurt. He sees that there actually may be some truth in this, and so he writes a letter to Felicia Hardy. 14 days later, there's a knock at Peter's door, and we see that the Black Cat really is going to take the place of Mary Jane Watson. Literally, within minutes, they're kissing, and then before too long, they are teaming up professionally as well as romantically. The Black Cat still has a tendency to sometimes take things a little bit too far, but her companionship really does benefit Spider-Man, and not just on an emotional level. We see an alternate Kraven's Last Hunt, where shortly after Peter has been put in the ground, the Black Cat finds and defeats Kraven, and then digs Peter out of his grave. But there is a sting in that tale, because in his drugged, half-delirious state, he thinks that it's Mary Jane that saved him. We see a retelling of the events of, I assume, Amazing Spider-Man issue 300, because we see Spidey and Venom in the bell tower. But in this version, again Felicia Hardy is present, and she defeats Venom with the Sonic Blaster. Wow, dumping MJ was the best thing Peter ever did. The Black Cat's insecurities aren't helped when one day when she answers the phone in Peter's apartment, Mary Jane is on the other end of the line. So when Peter Parker proposes to Felicia, she makes a point of tracking down Mary Jane and gloating, saying he left her at the altar, but he's going to marry the Black Cat. Unfortunately, that conversation is overheard by a member of New York's criminal fraternity. Or is it a member of the Warriors 3? He is then able to put two and two together and work out Spider-Man's civilian identity. This story, for the first time at this point in the history of What If, continues in the next issue, where beyond another tribute to the Amazing Spider-Man Annual 21 cover, we see that the knockoff Warriors 3 man is arranging to sell Spider-Man's identity to a disembodied voice at the end of a telephone line. The happy couple are actually married by page 2 of this issue, although as you'll see, it's a very unconventional marriage. One of the reasons for that is that they both still have deep-seated insecurities. Peter's is an old one where the Black Cat's concerned, and that is she doesn't love him, Peter Parker, at all. She only loves his costumed identity of Spider-Man. For the Black Cat, those concerns about Mary Jane still eat away at her, even though Peter decided to marry her and not MJ. This isn't helped when Peter receives a birthday card from Mary Jane, and the Black Cat claims that she's trying to steal him away from her. But there is arguably an even bigger problem than that. Felicia Hardy's identity as the Black Cat is publicly known, so that means that when the pair of them are fighting crime, they have to be careful what they say to each other within earshot of other people present. They can't even really go out in their civilian guises, because if anyone is able to link Peter Parker to Felicia Hardy, they will quickly work out that he is Spider-Man. Then we find out the identity of the villain that the Warriors 3 chap was trying to sell the secret to Spider-Man's civilian identity to, It's the Vulture! Now that would have been a much bigger surprise if it wasn't for the fact that his face was plastered in the bottom left-hand corner of the front cover. The first thing he does after finding out the information is blow up the old folks' home of May Parker. On hearing the news, Spider-Man races over there to discover that 6 people have died in the explosion, but May Parker isn't one of them. Nonetheless, he says he will make the Vulture pay. Speaking of the Vulture, he has tracked down Felicia Hardy, and after knocking her out with gas, is about to finish her off when Spider-Man bursts in and gives him the beating of his life. It's only because of the intervention of Silver Sable and her wild pack that he stops. Before they arrived, the Vulture had explained that it was down to the Black Cat's carelessness that Spider-Man's identity was leaked, and it's only a matter of time before it happens again. He asks the Black Cat about this, and she admits it must have been when she confronted MJ. He is furious because she has jeopardised everybody that he loves and cares about, and as a result, he says it's over. Interestingly, as he swings off, yes, she calls out Spider, but then shortly after that, she calls out Peter. He is beside himself with what's happened, and he ends up confiding in Silver Sable. She equally opens up her heart to him about the past tragedies of her life. The Vulture, meanwhile, is in the process of escaping from prison when he and we see a familiar looking silhouette, and it says to him that he has a lot of payback coming to him. Then he is left dying in a pool of his own blood, and the last words on his lips are Spider-Man. We then see Peter visiting Mary Jane. He wants to talk to her about things, but he's quickly scared off when he sees that she has male company. As he leaves her apartment, he is grabbed by Sandman and the rest of the Wild Pack, because he is now wanted for the murder of the Vulture. But as he's being held, Mary Jane arrives. She says she's known Spider-Man a very long time, and she knows that he did not kill the Vulture. And you know what? She's right. Because soon the Black Cat swings in and grabs Mary Jane, taking her up to a window ledge. Whilst there, she admits that she killed the Vulture. Really? Okay. At that point, Mary Jane loses her footing and slips from the window ledge. The Black Cat reaches out for her, but Paladin instinctively draws his gun and fires at the Black Cat. Paladin. Arguably the worst gun-toting vigilante in the whole of Marvel's stable of gun-toting vigilantes. Spider-Man swings in to catch Mary Jane and save her, but it turns out that Paladin is too good at his job and his shot was fatal. Spider-Man says they need to get her to a hospital, but she says it's too late for that, and she dies, with the last words on her lips being, "I love you, Spider." She just doesn't learn, does she? Although Mary Jane is there, this does not see a change in their fortunes. She and Peter Parker do not get back together. Too much water has gone under the bridge, and the two part permanently. Instead, Spider-Man finds comfort with Silver Sable. This blossoms into a full-blown romance, where things happen such as Silver Sable cooking for Spider-Man. And Peter says, "Now who would have thought the two-fisted Silver Sable was also a world-class chef?" To which she replies, "There's lots of things two fists can do, Parker." Moving on, the two of them fall fully in love. And unusually for What If, despite the death of the Black Cat and the fact that Mary Jane is no longer around, we actually have a happy ending. I think we've thoroughly covered the subject now. Alongside Clark Kent and Lois Lane, Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson must be the best known romantic relationship in comics. As such, it made perfect sense for them to marry. They had a great relationship, and that didn't change after they said "I do." If anything, it provided a new angle for their subsequent adventures, as seen when Venom visited MJ in their marital home, or when she walked the rain-lashed streets in Kraven's Last Hunt because Peter hadn't come home. So I guess that brings us to the elephant in the room. One more day The 2007 storyline that brought an end to the Parkers' 20-year marriage is, to say the least, controversial. Everyone seems to have their view on it, so here's mine. The issue wasn't that Peter and MJ's marriage came to an end. It was the fact that it was retconned in continuity, so that it never even happened, that was the problem for me. Then Editor-in-Chief Joe Quesada said he had never been a fan of the marriage. Fair enough, not everyone has to be. But to make it so that essentially 20 years of stories didn't happen smacks of disdain for all the creators involved in them and all the fans that loved them. The idea of the wedding was Stan Lee's, and Jim Shooter agreed to it because of the overwhelmingly positive response to the idea from fans. Stan Lee, the fans, pah, morons. Divorce them, fine, it happens. Kill her off, sure, she'll be back. But to say that all those great stories, and the slightly dodgy ones, are all somehow stained by the presence of Mary Jane and those bands of gold? I say thee nay.